Hello again everyone, and welcome to Stitch Bliss Corner. Mary Rose here with this special episode on Eleanor of Aquitaine. And this is coming about because of quite a few requests and expressions of interest in this rather amazing woman. So I'm not using last names, but I'm just acknowledging the people that have asked or expressed interest in Eleanor. Particularly Laura T, who asked me to look into this period in history. Also Kate of Kate's Crafting Corner. I Heart Cross Stitch, or yeah, that very pleasant girl. Now I'm trying to think. She pronounces her first name a certain way, so I won't say her first name because I'm not. It doesn't recall to mind at the moment exactly how you say it, so I don't want to say it incorrectly. Then there's Annette N, Joan C, Judy S, Connie B, and Lisa B of Luby's Lot. So thank you very much to all those people who have asked me to take a look at this woman who is still celebrated today. Now, when I was setting out to have a look at Eleanor, I was surprised that I had to backtrack and have a look at King Arthur and his origins, which wasn't what I was expecting. But it turned out that there is a connection between the two. And in order to understand a bit more about Eleanor and her court and what she was about, it's necessary to have a quick look at King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. So what I'm going to do is just do a very quick outline of Arthur. Now, there are hundreds of different explanations for the origins of Arthur, his nationality, because there is so much folklore and legend about it, because we're talking 6th century AD, so it was a very, very long time ago. And before there were written records, it was all word of mouth, which all added to the mystique of the whole thing. So what I've done is reduced it down to the simplest story of Arthur, because there are, as I said, there's so much information about him that you can easily get bogged down. So I've made some notes here, and I've just put the year of Arthur's death was 542 AD. He was a man of myth and legend. His story is mainly composed of folklore passed down through the generations. The legend of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Now, Arthur was the firstborn son of King Uther, that's Uther, Pendragon, and Igraine, Igraine, but even that name is not, it's spelt differently for different sources, of Cornwall. Now, that was his mother, Igraine of Cornwall. He was looked after by Merlin, a wise magician. Now, what happened was, this Igraine and King Uther Pendragon, the parents were concerned about the welfare of Arthur, because Arthur, it was a time when there was a lot of war going on, a lot of battles, and it was a very uncertain times. So they decided to keep his birth secret, and they sent him out to the country to live, and he was brought up under Merlin's, who was a magician, you know, the legendary Merlin. It was under his instruction that he went to live with this Sir Ector and his son Kay. So Arthur was a foster son and a foster brother to this Kay. Anyway, when he was 15, they went up to London. Sir Ector, his son Kay, and foster son Arthur. And Arthur was supposed to be helping Kay to get ready for a tournament and everything. Anyway, so Arthur got into trouble because he mislaid Kay's sword. So he went off out to find one, and there was a sword set in stone. And Arthur just went and pulled it out and took it back to the tournament. And Kay wondered where it had come from and everything. And of course then all the villagers were abuzz because they found that the sword had been taken out of the stone. Now this particular sword had inscribed upon it in gold letters. Now it had, what did it say? The exact name. The exact words. Whoso pulleth out this sword is the rightwise born King of all England. Well, after a bit of a kerfuffle and all the rest of it, they did recognise Arthur as king, even though he was 15. But the knights weren't happy about it because they didn't fancy following a boy. Anyway, so Merlin took Arthur down to the lake, where the Lady of the Lake was, and she gave Arthur a sword called Excalibur, and it had a scabbard with it. And when the Excalibur, killed all enemies basically without much effort, and the scabbard defended Arthur from injury, so he couldn't be injured either. So that was a big advantage in those days, as you can imagine. Anyway, now what happened? Just hang on a tick. When Arthur became king, he married Guinevere, whose father gave him the round table. Now I do have some pictures to show you in a minute. Now the table was created to have no head or foot, representing equality of all who sat round it. The knights were men of courage, honour, dignity, courtesy, and nobleness. They protected ladies and damsels, honoured and fought for kings, and undertook dangerous quests. Arthur lived in a big castle in a place called Camelot, under the guidance of Merlin, who, helped him through a lot of sticky moments, shall we say. I'm just going through here. And he defeated all the ones that held a rebellion against him, and then ended up, holding the kingdom together. Now, the unfortunate part of it, where it all started going pear-shaped, was that Lancelot, who was very handsome and the bravest of all the knights, fell in love with Guinevere. And Guinevere fell in love with him, and they used to sneak out to the woods for closer companionship, shall we say. And Mordred, who was Arthur's nephew, foster nephew kind of thing, he told Arthur. Well, anyway, Guinevere was arrested and found guilty and was supposed to be going to be burnt at the stake. But then Lancelot rescued her and took her over to Brittany, and they were over there. So Arthur went over to Brittany with a big army to try and sort things out over there. And while he was gone, Mordred was looking after England. But and Arthur didn't have any children, and Mordred would have inherited the kingdom, but he was too impatient, and he fought Arthur for the kingdom. Anyway, everybody in this legendary battle, apparently, on both sides, died. There was a truce to begin with, and then one of the soldiers killed a snake with a sword or something. And of course then the battle was on. It was a false moment, but it was too late to change anything. So anyway, Mordred was killed and Arthur was fatally wounded. And there's a very famous part of the folklore where Arthur has, because of course Arthur, you might think, well, how come Arthur was fatally wounded when he had his scabbard? Well, he didn't have the scabbard. It had been stolen from him by his wicked stepsister. What was her name? Morgan. So he didn't have the protection. Anyway, the famous part of it was Sir Bedivere, who was one of Arthur's faithful knights, was asked by Arthur to throw Excalibur into the lake because that was what he wanted done with it. He was the king and that's what he wanted. Anyway, Sir Bedivere rode off and came back, and Arthur said, when you cast it into the lake, what did you see? Oh no, the first time he came back, I think he just said, oh yes, I've done it. And Arthur said, no, you haven't. Go back and do it again. Anyway, he did go back to the lake and pretended again to throw the sword in. And then he came back to King Arthur and said, oh, I've thrown the sword in. And Arthur said to him, when you cast the sword into the lake, what did you see? And he said, I saw nothing but the wind upon the water. And he said, oh, you know, I couldn't do it. You know, Excalibur's such a beautiful sword, you know, it can't be lost. And Arthur said, you have to do what I've told you to do. So finally Sir Bedivere did take it back for the third time, and he took the sword by the blade and cast it up into the sky, and it went into the lake. And as the sword came down to the water, a hand came up from the Lady of the Lake, you know, with all the scales on the hand. It was kind of the outfit she had on, I suppose. The hand came out and she took the sword and submerged it down under the waves. And Sir Bedivere went back to tell Arthur. But by that time, Arthur had been borne away by young girls, or, you know, damsels, and taken over to the island of Avalon. And that's where he died of his injuries. He was taken on a boat, you know. But I'll show you some pictures about that. Yes, so that's sort of, in a nutshell, the story or the legend of King Arthur. And I'm just going to show you some of the pictures that go with it. This is from a book, The Search for King Arthur. And who's this one by? The editors of Horizon magazine, author Christopher Hibbert. So, a stern and regal Arthur is portrayed in this detail from a French tapestry made around 1385. The once and future king usually was identified in medieval art by 3 crowns, seen here on the pennant and on the gown. Oops, sorry. Well, that's really... Oh, I suppose maybe that was... He wasn't much of a looker, maybe. That's why Guinevere was keen on Sir Lancelot. Now we have... here we have Arthur in battle, and they forgot to put the jousting pole in, or the... He apparently had a lance, and that's not in there. But there's the dragon of his father's family. It's one of the symbols of the Pendragons. Then here is a picture here of something that will come in later. Poems and romances that recounted the pleasures and pains of courtly love spread rapidly from one country to another. And this is a picture of a knight there who has returned from battle to an adoring wife, and it says in the text here, shows a lady rewarding the devotion of a knight who continues feeding his falcon. So. Now, Tintagel, or Tintagel, birthplace of King Arthur. So that's the legendary birthplace. It looks suitably mystical, doesn't it? And then here's a picture of Arthur. The top picture is him pulling the sword from the stone, and the bottom picture is him offering the sword on the altar to his coronation. So, of course, the sword that he took out of the stone was not Excalibur. Now here's Merlin, wizard and prophet. Now it says that Geoffrey Monmouth is the person who wrote all about the Arthurian legends, and I think that is why his version is so celebrated. And his version has the Arthurian legends all coming from Wales, which is one of the reasons why Henry VII called his eldest son Arthur, the one that died. He wanted to draw on the legend of Arthur. And this here is a picture, it's not naturally of the time that it was supposedly happened. This is in the 1460s, but it's a rendering of Arthur and Guinevere getting married. Now here's the battle where everybody was vanquished, and Arthur was fatally wounded and Mordred was killed. Hope I've got all that in the shot there. And here is a picture here of Bedivere throwing the sword into the lake, and the Lady of the Lake taking the sword, Excalibur, and there's Arthur depicted there looking most dejected and upset. And the other picture here is of Arthur being surrounded by the queens and taken off to Avalon. So you can see that the legend has been the source of creativity for various artists over the centuries. For centuries, legend has associated the marshy, mysterious country around Glastonbury and Somerset with the island of Avalon, where Arthur was taken to be healed of his wounds. Of course, he wasn't healed, but... And it's very interesting that modern scholars, just as they do with Eleanor of Aquitaine, as it turns out, they tend to say, oh, this didn't happen, and that's highly unlikely. But they're still looking for these places. The archaeologists and everything are still trying to find traces of Arthur and various characters in history, even though in the second breath they say, oh, you know, I don't think that person existed. Overleaf. Arthur's knights are armed for battle by their ladies in a Victorian tapestry designed by Edward Burne-Jones and woven by William Morris. Both men were members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a group that sought to recreate the pure colours and spirit of early medieval art. And there they are, heading off into battle with the vision of their beautiful women sending them off. Times don't change that much, I don't think, when men are heading off to war, except now women head off to war as well, but then I suppose Eleanor fitted into that category as well, well ahead of her time, but that's coming up shortly. And there is the legendary round table. Now that, if you look at it carefully, you can see that there's a Tudor rose in the middle of it, and that's because it could well have been Henry VIII's reproduction, shall we say, of the original. Someone did say it's really an oak tree that was cut across the diameter and then they made it into a table. But anyway, you get the idea. And then this final one in here. The aura of Arthur's Britain still clings in the dark shadowed wood near Camelot in Cornwall. There, according to local legend, the Battle of Coghlan took place, costing Arthur his life, but ensuring his fame. Right, so that's from that book. And then somewhere along the line, I picked up in my travels this one, the Illustrated Encyclopaedia of Arthurian Legends by Ronan Coghlan, Coghlan. Now, there's just a few pictures in here you might be interested in. This one looks to me, I can't find what they've called this, but it looks to me like a picture, an illustration of Avalon, because this looks like Arthur surrounded by the damsels looking after him, and that looks like Merlin, rather desolate character. So I think that would be correct in this context anyway. Then here we have Guinevere and Ladies of the Court, detail from Lancelot and Guinevere. And there's Guinevere there. It's another one of Queen Guinevere, and then they've got, there's Guinevere, I've got it there, yeah, and next to it in a heart is Guinevere and Lancelot. Oh, I've just popped this one in because they had an Arthurian Harlequin as well. So naturally my husband was quite intrigued with that. And I must say at this stage, once again, to thank my husband for all his research and assistance to me. Now, this is the final little bit before we get on to Eleanor. And it's in the 60s, there was a musical called Camelot, and it starred Richard Harris. And I'm trying to think of the cast, but I can't. But anyway, I didn't watch it. But they did have a lot of the soundtracks on radio and everything because it was quite popular. And this encapsulates the kingdom of Camelot, the magical kingdom of Camelot. and it's Richard Burton actually speaks over the music, which we'll have a link below and you'll be able to have a look at it or listen to it anyway. And the lyrics are, it's true, the crown has made it clear, the climate must be perfect all the year. A law was made a distant moon ago here, July and August cannot be too hot, and there's a legal limit to the snow here in Camelot. The winter is forbidden till December, and exit March the 2nd on the dot. By order summer lingers through September in Camelot. Camelot, Camelot. I know it sounds a bit bizarre, but in Camelot, Camelot, that's how the conditions are. The rain may never fall till after sundown. By 8 the morning fog must disappear. In short, there's simply not a more congenial spot for happily ever aftering than here in Camelot. Camelot, Camelot, I know it gives a person pause, but in Camelot, Camelot, those are the legal laws. The snow may never slush upon the hillside. By 9 p.m. the moonlight must appear. In short, there's simply not a more congenial spot for happily ever aftering than here in Camelot. Well, it might have been happily ever aftering for some of them, but for poor Arthur and Guinevere, I'm not so sure it was so happily ever aftering, but that's the way it goes, I guess. Right, so now we go on to Eleanor, and I hope that that prequel will make some sense once we get into this. Now, Alison Weir, who is a historical novelist, and she's quite forensic in a lot of the historical novels she puts out. But she says a fact-based historical book is more... She says it's good to be able to use license in a book if you can't get the actual historical facts to back it up. And in the case of Eleanor of Aquitaine, she has written a book, and she's had to do that in places because there is no real written record of much of Eleanor's life, partly because she was a woman, and what was written about her tended to be written by men that weren't exactly thrilled with the way she was conducting herself. So most of the information of this era is from monks writing things, chronicles and things, and contemporary chroniclers of the time who were familiar with the court and the great figures of the age. There's no written record of a legendary beauty, but Alison says that the monkish chroniclers did not pay much heed to women, even queens. Many of the chroniclers were not written for accuracy, so much as moral instruction, and to learn the lessons of what could go wrong if you were not God-fearing. A king could be brought down just as equally as a poor man. So with that in mind, much of what I say isn't proven, and I think in the end you probably have to work out for yourself what sort of person you think Eleanor was. But I must say that, considering we're talking about an era where women were not even acknowledged, she must have had something about her, because there were plenty of people talking about her. So anyway, I will just show you the family tree here, which my husband has put together for me, to place Eleanor and her husbands in history. So up here you have William William the First. That's William the Conqueror. He was the one that was in the Bayeux tapestry that I did, in time gone by. Now, down through William, came Henry II. Okay, so that's where he comes in. Now, Henry II was Eleanor's second husband, so that's where he came from. Then moving along, on Eleanor's side, she came down from this side of the family. That's her there. And her father was William X, Duke of Aquitaine. And her grandfather was William IX, Duke of Aquitaine. Now, William IX was known to be quite a man with the ladies, you know. He put it about a bit, as you might say. And he was also a troubadour, which was someone that made music and made rhymes to music. So he was very much more of a theatrical and someone who was interested in the arts and literature and all that sort of, well, you know, such as it was. All the legendary tales and all that sort of thing. He was into all that kind of thing. Poetry and all that, the gentle things. So he passed that on down to William. Now, William was very ambitious for his family. Now, as it happens, Aquitaine, which I shall show you here, Aquitaine was a very big part of what is now modern France. It was all the west. And so when her father died, his son had also died. So Eleanor inherited all of William's land, all of Aquitaine, which was vast, vast provinces. And France, in those days, you had the little French kingdom, but the rest of the land mass was all made up of different provinces, of which Aquitaine was one. And although there was a king of France, he was expected to go in and try and sort the provinces out if there was any trouble in any of them. But most of them were independently run by all the dukes and everything. So that the French king didn't have a lot of land. He had supposed power, but not a lot of land. And so what happened was, when William X, when his son died, he was very concerned for Eleanor, because her being the heiress to this vast amount of land, she was prey to anyone coming along to try and marry her and to basically, well, he wanted the land to be passed down to his own children in a way, and the son had gone. So this one, Eleanor, was the one that received it. So then he wanted to make a good marriage for her, to try and hold this all together. And he sewed up a marriage between Louis of France, who was the son of Louis VI. Well, he ended up being Louis VII when his father died. But William made sure that when he died, Eleanor was looked after and the land was looked after, because he arranged this marriage through Louis VI, that the son, because of course Louis VI was happy because he thought, well, my son is going to get Aquitaine, that'll give me a huge amount of power for France, because I will be, you know, my son will be inheriting or taking on the land that Eleanor brings to the marriage. But there was a proviso in that the land would only be inherited by issue from those two. And if there was no issue that could inherit it, Eleanor kept it. So that was a proviso in the arrangements. I don't know how he swung that, but anyway, he did. So anyhow, I'll get back to that later. So now we have the situation where I shall just go through Eleanor's story with that bit of background. As you can see, it's a bit convoluted. Now, Eleanor was the richest and most powerful woman in Europe in her lifetime. She was first married to the French King Louis VII and was married second to Henry II. And I'll go through what happened there. This is just a quick summary. This marriage produced two English kings, Richard the Lionheart and John. Her father was William X, Duke of Aquitaine, and her mother was Eleanor Amory. When Eleanor was born, she was named Aenor, after her mother. In their language, this meant another Aenor, another, but they put the names together to create the name Eleanor in English. She was the eldest of three children, and when her brother died, she became heiress to the province of Aquitaine, the largest and richest of provinces that would become most of modern-day France. Her father died in 1137 when she was 15 years old, and she became the most sought-after bride in Europe. She married Louis VII of France and brought to him, I said about the kingdoms and everything, the amount of land she brought. She also gave him a rock crystal vase that still exists. Now I have a picture of that here. There it is. She brought that as a gift at their wedding. A rock crystal vase are made of rock crystal, a type of hard stone carving. Such vases were rare, expensive, and decorated with gold and jewels, used by royalty in Europe. It was probably originated in the 7th century and given when she married King Louis. The inscription on it says, he in turn gave it to the Abbey of St. Denis. It's now in the Louvre in Paris and is the only artefact of Eleanor's known to exist today. So, that's that one. Then, and she wasn't very happy with Louis as a husband because Louis wasn't expecting to be king to begin with because he had a brother, but the brother died. But most situations in those days, if you were the second brother to the heir, your life was destined for the church. And as it happened, Louis was pretty happy with the idea of becoming a monk. It suited him. So he wasn't that thrilled that he had to turn around and get married. So she was always complaining that she'd married a monk because he wasn't that keen on the marital bed. So it took quite a few years before they had children. And when they did, they were two girls, which didn't assist the French throne at all, as far as they were concerned. Anyway, Louis decided that he was going to go on a crusade, and Eleanor didn't want to be left at home, so she went along as well. And on the way, they stopped off at a place called Antioch, which is modern-day Turkey. And as legend would have it anyway, she was very keen on her uncle. Now, what was his name? I usually know his name. Raymond, I think it was. Yeah, Raymond. And Raymond apparently was very, very good looking. And supposedly Eleanor and him were enjoying each other's company a little bit too much. And Louis was very annoyed about all this. And he insisted that she come back to France with him. And she said she didn't want to do that. She said she wanted to annul the marriage because of consanguinity, because they were cousins, so many generations removed. Now, this idea of being able to annul a marriage was very convenient for kings and princes, because if they married someone and she, gave them daughters, they could annul the marriage using consanguinity, that they were related distantly, in order to get a new wife, in order to try and get sons. So it worked okay for them. But Eleanor was trying to use it for her, for a woman, saying, I want an end to this marriage because I feel that it's consanguinity. Well, of course, the Pope was having none of it because it was a woman. And she she did go back to France with Louis, and they did have 2 children, 2 girls. But I think Henry then, when he found that he wasn't going to have male issue with Eleanor, he decided that he would call it quits, which he did. Now, her vast estates then, of course, reverted to her. And within a year, she surprised everyone and scandalised everyone by marrying Henry, who became King of England, Henry II. Now, Henry II, just do a little bit about him now. Apparently I think I've got a description of him here. Henry II, born, and this is around, I think his was accurate, 1133, described as burly, cultivated, and foul-tempered, a warrior with penetrating eyes and an enormous amount of energy. Now, his mother was Matilda, and she was a very strong woman. She was actually supposed to take the throne in England after her father died, the king. And the king wanted an oath sworn because what happened was his son died tragically in a harbour crossing, and he was just prostrate for 2 days, didn't know what to do, and decided he was worried about the end of the dynasty. So he got all his nobles together and got them to swear fealty to Matilda. And Matilda wanted to take over. She did want to be queen. But when Henry I died, the nobles wouldn't cop it. So Matilda ended up not being queen. And to cut a long story short, anyway, Henry ended up becoming king, largely through Matilda's machinations to make him king, because she probably thought if she couldn't be queen, she'd make sure that her son was king, which is what did happen. There were naturally enough, there was a power vacuum when she couldn't take over, and Stephen took over, King Stephen, but he took over supposedly to keep the kingdom peaceful, and it was anything but. Everybody was scrapping. Anyway, to get back to Henry, his father was Geoffrey Plantagenet, Duke of Anjou, and so the kingdom was called the Angevin Kingdom, and that's how big it was, the Angevin Empire. Okay, the solid yellow is the Angevin possessions, and the checked yellow is the hegemony. So they had influence over the rest of it. Okay, so now Eleanor had something to say about the Angevins, because I think she was quite attracted to him to begin with. She was 11 years older than him, but she was still a young woman in her 20s. And he was bowled over by her. He thought she was very fetching. But probably they were too close in their natures, and they started to clash fairly quickly. but I think they still had a great attraction to each other because she had quite a few children in a fairly short amount of time. And I think when you have access to mistresses and all the rest of it, he could have just ignored her if he'd wanted to. But obviously, he must have been keen on her to have that many children. Anyways, got here. Queen Eleanor, the remarkable and beautiful woman who was the wife of King Henry II of England, known as Plantagenet, once told her youngest son John that her husband's family, the Angevins, were descended from the devil. The tradition was that an early Count of Anjou, the house to which King Henry II belonged, had been married to Melusine, who was Satan's daughter, a fact that was discovered because she never attended Mass, and when at last she was made to do so, flew out of a high window in the church and disappeared. Thus the Angevins were known as the Devil's Brood, and brother was destined to fight against brother, and son against father. So indeed it happened in John's lifetime. Now here is a picture of Eleanor's effigy over her tomb in Fontainebleau, and you'll notice that she's carrying a book, and apparently that wasn't common for a woman to have a book, but it's a reference to the fact that she was educated as a child. Her father ensured that she was educated in all the Latin and all these other languages, and so that she had a very good bedrock of knowledge to draw upon. And I should imagine that a female with the same amount of knowledge as the men, with land and with beauty, was probably someone that had a certain amount of entitlement about her that would have intimidated quite a lot of men. It didn't intimidate Henry, of course, but it would have done for quite a few. The castle of Chinon in Touraine, one of the most vital of the Angevin fortresses. This is where Henry II died. So I'll just show you that. That comes a little bit later, but that's where he died anyway. Just while I've got this book here. And this book is The Life and Times of King John, and it's by Maurice Ashley. So I'll just pop that one down there. And also, another little thing about the Plantagenet Kings. The Angevin Empire in the 12th century, the territories extended from Scotland to the Pyrenees that were ruled by King Henry II, Richard I and John. They were called the Angevin Kings because Henry's father was the Count of Anjou. Plantagenet Kings were a line of kings from Henry II, he was the first Plantagenet king, to Richard III, he was the last Plantagenet king. Plantagenet refers to a sprig of broom with a reference to the crest of the Angevin kings. And I do have a little picture of a sprig of broom. There it is there, the sprig of broom. And of course, if there was a messenger in those days, they would have a sprig of broom or something like that, so that the person would know that the message was from the king or whoever it was supposed to be delivered to. The messenger was considered to be bona fide if he had a sprig of broom with him. Well, that's what they say anyhow. Right. Anyway, so let's get back to... So you've got a bit of an idea now about Henry. So I'll just go back now to go through and recap everything to bring it all together for you. Now, Eleanor, daughter-in-law of Matilda, she had as much determination as Matilda, Eleanor was not typical in the sense of a woman in anything she did. She spent years at the centre of machinations of the goings-on in Europe. Her father was the Duke of Aquitaine, and Eleanor grew up in the city of Poitiers, Potiires. It was a centre of poetry and flamboyance and wit. So very different to Henry's world. And Henry, I think he was totally befuddled by the whole idea of Aquitaine and Poitiers, where Eleanor had been born and brought up. It just didn't quite compute in his head. It was a sumptuous early life, but at 13 she was removed from it. A powerful match. She was married to the heir to the French throne, Louis. The king died suddenly, and Eleanor found herself to be Queen of France, wife to King Louis VII. He was quite immature and was puppyish towards his beautiful wife. Eleanor was not impressed with him and said he was more a monk than a king. Eleanor took 8 years to bear him a child, but she was a girl. Eleanor was only 21. Eleanor and Louis decided to go on a crusade. In 1147 she received the Pope's blessing. Louis and Eleanor had joined the Christian West, who opposed the Muslim East to control Jerusalem. This was the first sign that Eleanor was no ordinary queen. She was quite prepared to travel thousands of miles and risk war and disease. But she also faced a scandal. In 1148 they sought shelter at Antioch, and that's when she was attracted to Raymond of Poitiers, said to be the handsomest of all the princes of the earth, and Eleanor is said to have been delighted in his company, and there was real chemistry between them, and scandal and speculation spread across Europe. And when Louis was ready to move on, Eleanor refused to leave with her husband. On it went, and that's when she went for the consanguinity, and Louis insisted that they leave together, and she did go dutifully with him for 2 years and gave birth to the other daughter, which was Alex. But then she met a man who would change the course of her life. This man was Matilda's son Henry, future King of England. In 1151 he was there for peace talks, and they say that she met him there, and he was 9 years younger than her, charismatic and vigorous, fiery and boundless energy as a soldier and leader. And of course in those days, to be a king you had to be a warrior, and you had to be very courageous and brave, and I think that was one of the reasons why queens, they didn't even countenance the idea of a queen leading a nation, because number one, they weren't allowed to wear armour, trousers, pants, or whatever they had, hose or whatever the men wore, because that was considered to be blasphemous. So I mean, you're behind the 8 ball right from the start. Can't get on a horse with flowing garments, but and expect to battle people. So I think that was one of the reasons why women were not given much credence. But anyway, they hadn't banked on Eleanor, because she did, although that's supposed to be a bit of a unlikely that she went to the Crusades and fought, she did go along, and I mean it was pretty dangerous, with disease and all the rest of it. So she went, and I can give her a due in that way. Let's see. Yes, 8 weeks and 2 days after the annulment of her marriage to Louis, Eleanor married Henry. Henry was 11 years younger than Eleanor and was her third cousin. By marrying him, though, she shifted the balance of power in Europe. She had inherited the vast duchy of Aquitaine from her father, and by marrying Henry, between them they held the territory from the Pyrenees right up to the Scottish borders, which the Pyrenees are down there somewhere. So they had all that land between the two of them. Now there'll be a bit of noise because someone's just coming home, so if you hear a noise in the background, that's what it is. Eleanor had shown that she had determined her own future, but she found in her second marriage that she was not the strongest influence on her husband's life. Her mother-in-law was. That was Matilda, that I told you about before. But when Matilda died, well, of course, Eleanor got a lot, more power. Now, she produced 8 living children in 15 years. Eleanor, at the age of 43, began her real power plays. So when Matilda was off the scene, Eleanor felt that it was time to flex her muscles a bit. Now, the task of governing the huge empire was very difficult, and Henry was always on the move. Now, Aquitaine was very foreign to Henry, but it was her homeland, and in 1168 Eleanor went to the duchy to govern in Henry's name. Well, of course, the people in that area were happy to have her back because she was their duchess. But apart from that, she didn't have any problems like Matilda did in loyalty to her because Henry was behind her. So in his name she was ruling. So the nobles copped that. The men were prepared to accept that. And she was very happy to, well, naturally she was glad to be back. She had a vast palace there, and she exercised great power because she was seen as Henry's representative. So the nobles accepted her, and her court was seen as one of the great courts of chivalry. Aquitaine was the home of the Troubadours, knights who swore devotion to unattainable ladies and swore to do heroic deeds to win their hearts. Eleanor was at the centre of these stories about whether true love can exist in marriage. The legend was that she and her court were the queen of romance, but there is no historical proof of this. Power was important to Eleanor, and she asserted a bid for power through her children. Now, I think probably what happened was Eleanor got back to Aquitaine, and she really enjoyed the autonomy that she had. And during this time, the legend built up of the courtly love, which, a quick description of that is, for many years, courtly love was believed to be a medieval code of love that originated with the Troubadours and described the amorous behaviour of aristocratic ladies and their lovers. Courtly love is said to depict real relationships that were adulterous and passionate and bordered on idolatry. Typically, her man, who was usually a knight, fell in love with a noblewoman who was invariably married and often of a higher social rank. For a long period he would keep silent before declaring his love, after which he would devote himself to her service, becoming a slave to her every whim. Only after lengthy trials and secret pledges might their love be consummated. Faithlessness between lovers, rather than adultery, was held to be the mortal sin. The love described as akin to worship, and the course of the relationship was likened to a holy pilgrimage. It was generally accepted that such beliefs described actual practice. So this is where the King Arthur legend and the Knights of the Round Table and all that sort of thing came in. It appears that Eleanor borrowed heavily from that kind of life, that kind of world, and conveniently and coincidentally, it elevated the level of women to be seen as goddesses, to be seen as not a chattel, but someone to be revered, for knights to go out and do deeds to win their love, to treat them with respect, to treat them gently. So I think Eleanor was using that to elevate the status of women. And here's a picture here which kind of makes me think of Eleanor. This is the medieval knight at war. You've seen this book before. if you've seen any of my previous videos. Now, there was something called the dubbing ceremony for a knight. And it says the dubbing ceremony itself had its origins in secular tradition and did not necessarily take place in a church. The earliest account of dubbing ceremony is in 1128 by Geoffrey the Fair of Anjou, for example, and it makes no mention of the church's role. Now it says here, dubbing was usually performed by another knight or sometimes by a lady. The sponsor presented the inductee with a sword, which symbolised the shape of the cross. The sword's two edges served to remind the knight to be that justice and loyalty were two sides of the knight's power. If the ceremony was being conducted in a church, the inductee proceeded to the altar, and there a priest removed the sword from where it hung around the knight's-to-be's neck and placed it on the altar and blessed it. The sponsor rose and asked the inductee, "For what purpose do you wish to enter knighthood?" He took an oath to follow 4 commandments, never to consent to lies or treason, always to honour women and be ready to serve them, to go to Mass every day, and to fast on Fridays in memory of Christ. And then we have this picture here. And can't you just imagine Eleanor in her court doing something like that? And once you've done something like that, I think it said here, what they say, dubbing was usually accompanied by a phrase from the sponsor, like, "Be thou a good knight," or "In the name of God, St. Michael and St. George, I make you a knight." And the new knight's response might be, "So shall I be, with God's help." And they just sort of, oh, it's just a lovely picture, that one. But so you can imagine, and she and her women apparently at court too, if there was a dispute between lovers or whatever, she'd have a little court of women that would decide the fate of the lovers and all that sort of thing. Anyway, to get back to what happened, Henry had he had the oldest son, Henry, then he had Richard, and then there was John. I think there was another son in there somewhere. I think he died though. Now the first one, Henry, got very ambitious, and it may well have been Eleanor saying, "Look, see if you can get some power out of your father. He's got this vast empire and he's running around running it all himself, surely it's time that you had a bit of land as well." So he made him kind of a young king, but not really a proper one. So it was basically lip service. He just gave him a title and hoped that he'd be happy with it. But they soon got wise to that. And Eleanor and her sons decided that they were going to try and wrest the throne from Henry. So they had a rebellion happening against Henry. And let's see. I think I'll put it down here to make it a bit easier. Although Henry had promised roles for his sons, he could not bring himself to give any of them real power in the sprawling kingdom. Well, it's a bit like King Lear. You've got to be careful as a king as well, because if you give your land and your power away before you're gone, before you're dead, look what happened to King Lear. He was destroyed. So probably Henry knew better than to give any of them anything. So in 1173, the eldest son had had enough of waiting and joined the side of Henry's enemy. That was the King Eleanor's ex-husband, Louis, the King of France. Henry was devastated at his eldest son's betrayal, but things got worse when he got a much bigger shock. When he sent for Eleanor and their younger sons, he found that Eleanor had also left for Paris. She wasn't in open revolt of her... Oh, sorry, she was. Beg your pardon. Getting a bit getting a bit jaded here. She was in open revolt of her husband and king. The reason, was told, was that Eleanor was very angry because Henry was having an affair with a woman referred to as the Fair Rosamond Clifford, the Rose of the World. Now, the chances of that being correct, I think, are fairly low, because what did Eleanor care about what Henry got up to, really? So it was probably more ambition through her sons. She's probably had a good taste of what it was like to be a ruler in Aquitaine, and I think maybe she was thinking that she could get a bit more power through her sons. But anyway, I can't get inside her head, so I don't really know for sure. No one really knows why she took this action. A king taking a mistress was common, and Eleanor would have expected him to be doing that. But she had a formidable political brain. It's more likely that the power he had given her in Aquitaine was not enough for her. Henry was standing in the way of her ambition. She was always courageous and independent, and she rebelled against Henry and left him, just as she did her first husband. Also, naturally enough, the clergy were horrified of what she was doing, and someone, the Bishop of Rouen, sent Eleanor a letter and said that she threatened the very fabric of society. Man is the head of woman. We know that unless you return to your husband, you will be the cause of great general ruin. Well, in a way, it did end up that way, because there was a lot of upheaval in Europe for a long time because of the machinations of what was going on. But Eleanor defied that. She mustered support from the disaffected lords of Aquitaine, who were always ready to defy Henry. She rode north to meet her sons, but she never arrived. She was captured en route by her husband's forces, and she was, according to chroniclers, disguised as a man, which of course again outraged everyone of the day, because by law women weren't allowed to do that. Now, once their mother was captured, the boys just fell apart and basically threw themselves on the mercy of the father. And of course he did it, he went fairly lightly on them. But he wasn't light on Eleanor. He put her in confinement in England somewhere, and they're still not sure exactly where she was confined. But she was kept prisoner for around 15 to 16 years. And, well, it would have, you can imagine how difficult that must have been, all those years and years and years. It would have broken most people, but not Eleanor. She was very resourceful and determined as a person. She must have been. Let's see what happened here. Eleanor was blamed for the family's descent into civil war, and in the 15 years Eleanor was under lock and key, they kept on fighting. The conflict claimed the life of her eldest son, that was Henry, and didn't stop until 1189, when at the age of 56 Henry II died. Richard, Eleanor's favourite child, became king. That was Richard the Lionheart. And Richard sent word to England that Eleanor was now a free woman. Now, Eleanor was 65 years old by that stage, and she'd been incarcerated for all those years. Now, Richard allowed her to be Queen of England and to do whatever she wished with the kingdom. She ruled England because Richard was away on the crusade, and her rule was accepted because she was the king's mother and acting in his absence. Eleanor travelled from city to city and castle to castle with her entourage. She had to rule for much longer than anticipated because on the way home from the crusade, Richard was captured, and Eleanor went all around the kingdom collecting revenue and riches to send the ransom to get her son home. He died, though, during the siege in France, and Eleanor ensured the succession of her youngest son, John. At the age of 75, she travelled the length and breadth of France to support John's rule, and eventually age and exhaustion caught up with her, and she lived a quiet life in a convent. And the nuns were very what's the word? They wrote very admiringly of her and very complimentary of her as a person. In 1204, 31st of March, aged 80, she died and was laid to rest beside her husband in Fontainebleau. Now there are versions. Who was it? Wait a minute. I was sent a link to a picture of Eleanor that one, was stitching. It's a, what's the word I'm looking for? Needlepoint, that's the word I'm looking for. Needlepoint version of Eleanor. And this is where you have to make your decision here about which Eleanor you think is the one you would visualise. Beg your pardon, that's my phone, it's on the other one. I'll just find the name of the person. Probably have to cut a bit of this out just to, so you're not sitting here waiting for me to find it. Annette. Back again. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Gay Anne Rogers has done a needlepoint design of her. Let's find it for you. Oh, hang on, no, that's not right. Put her on the iPad. Yeah, there she is. There's one version of Eleanor. She's certainly captured the beauty, hasn't she? And then, of course, there's the other version, the Heaven and Earth design version. And I would imagine that both would apply to this remarkable woman who probably subsequent queens and princesses, sorry for scrabbling there, queens and princesses must have modelled themselves. Maybe even Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Woodville took some leaves out of Eleanor's book, because it's all very well for historians to say, oh, that never happened and that wasn't likely and all this sort of thing, but they weren't there. And most legends, from what I can see of it, start with truth somewhere along the line for them to be legends and to grow and go on. And so I was quite surprised to find out all the things I did, and that it ended up heading off towards King Arthur's court and everything. So very rudimentary outline, and I think I got a bit garbled here and there, but I'm sorry about that. But it's just it's what to leave out, what to leave in, and all the rest of it. But anyway, so if you were ever wondering about this person, there's a bit of an outline. Now I was going to, well, I wasn't actually. I was going to say I was going to show you something, but of my stitching. But I think I started. When I started, I thought, well, no, I won't be doing that because this is a separate, away from stitching anyway. and then people can avoid it if they want to, if they're not interested. So I shall catch you next time, and thank you very much for watching, and it's goodbye for now from Stitch Bliss Corner. Goodbye.